Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible. Yeah. I don't know whether I'm audible or not.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Great.
All right, wonderful. We are all set and ready to go. We we have a nice little echo.
That's fine. Yeah.
So you can also do a song with the echo. Anyway, let me welcome Professor Sarangi, Gopal Sarangi from Terry. Has chosen a very interesting topic, conundrum. Conundrum is a really interesting word in economics, in public policy, and perhaps most importantly, in any kind of transition. But energy transition, perhaps in today's world, has some of the most difficult conundrum. So we are delighted that Professor Sarangi has chosen to speak on this. I say so because when I started working on climate change, for example, which was in 1990, before many people were born, I guess. And I've watched the challenge of global actors and within countries, national actors competing for policy space in the energy world, whether it be government public policy or whether it be markets, whether it be energy security, or whether it be energy contribution to climate change. A whole range of challenges. Sometimes it had to do with technology transfer. Sometimes it had to do with greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes it had to do with justice, climate justice. So all kinds of challenges. So we are delighted to have an expert who will address what he sees as the key conundrum of this energy transition that the world needs. So, Professor Sarangi, we have an hour. So maybe if you can take 35, 40 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. I hope you're okay with that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Singh. I hope that I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, well,
Yeah.
visible as
Thank
well.
you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your nice introduction to the topic itself. And thanks to the International Conference on Public Policy and Economics to invite me to speak on a topic which is very close to my heart. And I'm sure that many of those who are actually joining today would like the topic because the topic itself is very complex and emerging day by day, expanding day by day. So thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to this interesting platform to discuss about some of the new ideas coming up and some of the complexities that India is going to face in the times to come. Let me upload my PPT. Just I hope the screen is visible to. Is it visible to all of you? Is the screen visible?
Yes, visible.
Right. Right. So what I'm going to do in next 45 minutes will basically have divided my talk into two different parts. One, I'll be basically discussing some of the general complexities that the world is undergoing and what Professor Singh has referred to. And then I come down to specific issues that India is facing, primarily focusing on two critical discussions around energy transition. That is why I said that it's a public policy conundrum because some of the issues are unclear as of now. The direction that is going to take is also not very clear. So given this, let me, my talk of the today is structured like this. I would start looking at characterizing what exactly it connotes when we say energy transition, and then why there is a need for energy transition, And there is a whole lot of discussion on the net zero that we keep on discussing. I'll also throw some light on that. And then I'll come down to specific issues in the Indian context, primarily focusing on two interesting set of aspects which India is going to have. One is the coal transition debate. Of course, most of the transition debates that India is facing is revolving around coal transition. Of course, the transition debate, the transition narrative is not exactly the coal transition. It is much more expansive, much more wider than the coal transition discussion that's happening. And then we'll also throw some light on the transition debate, which is around the dichotomies when I talk about the centralized grid-based renewable energy systems vis-a-vis decentralized and off-grid energy systems. Then some of the concluding remarks. As I said, the idea basically not to conclude the talk, rather to kind of provoke that there have been a lot of interesting ideas which are evolving within the energy transition, and each of these ideas are actually translating into public policy issues. And so the concluding remarks are basically indicative in nature, showing that there exists a whole lot of conundrums, and that requires a lot of research and research intervention, particularly if you really want to resolve some of these.
Professor
Let me
Sangi,
start. Yes,
before you
please.
start, if I might just say that we have another session
Right.
at 3 p.m. So if you can kindly present until about 2:45,
I'll do that. I'll do that.
then
So
we'll
I'll
have
I'll try to
complete
complete
the
in 30
discussion.
minutes. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So just to give an idea of how to characterize energy transition, I would start with looking at the energy system itself, and which has been referred as quite unsustainable from multiple angles, be it social, be it economic, be it environment. The existing dispensation of energy system is not sustainable. And importantly, there has been a transition happening, and this transition is not only about the technological shift. And that is where the role of public policy comes in, because it's not only about technological shifts, rather it actually evolves, basically kind of revolving around whole lot of issues. It could be issue of regulation, could be issue of tariff, structuring, could be issue of pricing and all that. And as I said that the technology is not only the central technology would be there, but at the same time, you can think of regulation, behavioral and other aspects of transition, which are very, very crucial when you talk about energy transition in a detailed manner. Now, importantly, there's also been a discussion around transition is about the scale, size, and sectoral dimensions. And when you talk about scale, I mean, also one of the issues is also the rate along with scale. If you go back to COP26 in Glasgow, the major discussion of the COP26 in Glasgow was about the rate. At what rate you want to transit? Will it be incremental or will it be radical? Will it be different for different countries? And particularly if you refer to this rate in the Indian context, there has been neither incremental nor radical. So there are people who oppose to both the ideas. It has been also told that you can go for somewhere in the middle. So the rate at which you transit is something very, very crucial as far as the energy transition is concerned. Size and scale are equally important. When I talk about scale, as I said that if you look at Indian energy transition, this transition debate is said to be hijacked by the coal transition. But that's not true. The transition happens at different scales. You talk of micro scale, at household scale, even at individual scale. You talk of the mission, life mission, and you talk of, let's say, things are
Gopal,
happening at the, yes.
have you changed your slide?
Yes, I mean the transition discourses are disruptive. That's right. The title is that.
Oh, we're still seeing your very first outline slide.
Oh, I see.
So I thought you had changed, but we are not seeing the changing slides. Slides are not changing for some reason.
Maybe I can
I don't know if it's
reshare
your
that.
end or our end. I don't know why the slides are not changing. It is. So you might want to reshare. Just stop
I'll
sharing.
I'll do that. I'll do that. I'll let me reshare it. Yeah. I think if I make it full screen, probably it's not moving. I'll have to be.
In the other slide. Try it again. Let's see.
Yeah, so can you see this slide, the size, scale, and sectoral dimensions in the first bullet point? Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I think I'm sorry, I cannot make it full screen. If I make it full screen, it's not then
Oh,
moving,
it's
I think.
visible, so that's fine. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
okay. So then you have this multiplicity of actors you talk of, and importantly, when you talk about energy transition, the most important set of actors is the private actors, particularly in the domain of renewables and related areas. So it becomes important to understand how these actors are placed vis-a-vis the existing actors, in the incumbent actors which are already there in the field. So that is something which is also making the whole thing complex. So not only that, I think when we talk about the implications, the process of transition, so it also involves socioeconomic transition issues. So it's all beyond technology, all beyond economics, all beyond society. So it's actually amalgamation of whole lot of factors that contributes to the transition. So that is why the question of transition is much more complex, much more complicated in the Indian context. Of course, not only in Indian context, in global context as well. There is also this time frame of transition which is being discussed. I'll quickly go through this given the time constraint. Fact is that when you look at the time frame, if you go back to the historical time frame, it almost took 500 years for the coal sector to become the dominant sector of global energy supply. And when you come down, you see that crude oil took almost like 100 years. And it's expected that the transition, particularly towards renewables, would be much more faster. It might take 3-4 decades. So what is coming out from this time frame essentially is that the time frame indicates that it's not only incremental, it might radical in some parts of the globe, but eventually how that radicality is going to be translated into a country context is something which is very, very crucial to understand. And that is something which is also very important when we talk about transition issues. Now let me come back to the question of why the transition is required. What are the imperatives around the transition? Everybody knows about this slide. This slide is always shown in when you talk about energy. I think the substantial component of the CO2 emissions, GHG emissions globally, is coming from the energy. Almost like 3/4 of the GHG emission is coming from energy. So that essentially means that energy could be a reason as well as could be the panacea if when you talk about the transition. So energy sector is prioritized given the fact that almost 3/4 of the global emissions is coming from the energy sector. If you look at how these emissions are basically distributed across countries, you can clearly see from this graph that there are countries, those who are actually experiencing a shift in terms of the annual CO2 emissions. But there you can clearly, if you look at the countries, they're divided into two different categories. If you look at, let's say, European Union, Europe, or let's say North America. So what you exactly see, that is the size of the annual CO2 emissions is kind of experiencing a fall, whereas in case of China, India, and Asia, excluding China and India, you see there is a rise. So that essentially means that some of the developing countries which are in the development path are experiencing a rise in the annual CO2 per capita emission, annual CO2 emission, whereas other countries are experiencing a declining in trend. But that is not completing the story. The story is here when you look at the per capita emission, which also is debated worldwide, being negotiated in every year in conference parties. What you see here is that even though India is tagged as the third largest global emitter, of course, in annual terms, not in cumulative terms. But what is coming out very clearly is that when you look at the per capita emission, the per capita emission is far, far below compared to other countries, even compared to China and even compared to global average, almost like 1/4 of the global average. So that clearly indicates that the story of the annual CO2 emissions, or we talk about the third global emitter, is not correct as far as the size of the population is concerned. So that essentially means that this essentially means that when you talk about development in energy terms, what indicator you need to choose when you talk about the GHG emission, the CO2 emission, that does matter for a country like India, which is on a development trajectory. Now, these two slides I can skip. This essentially tells you the fact that let's for example, some developed countries are trying to decouple energy from the growth. But whereas some developing countries, including India, has not been done so far because I said that we are in the development trajectory and our energy coefficient for every unit of GDP is much more higher compared to other countries. So that essentially means that we need more space to develop both in terms of the climate change, also in terms of energy. We'll discuss that in a moment's time. I'll just come back to the issue of the climate change because, as I said, that energy is the central to the climate discourse, and climate change is actually leading to, I mean, given the fact that there is a strong nexus that exists between the energy and climate change, and climate vulnerability is expanding day by day, and there is the need and imperative for reducing the energy consumption or maybe using the energy in a more sustainable manner. Let's throw some light on this vulnerability quickly, just to give an idea of the fact that if you look at what is happening to the annual global temperature, you can quickly see in this particular diagram is that in this particular graphic is that it essentially telling you that last 30 years, the global warming is much more faster than last, if you look at historically. So if you can clearly see here that the lower graph essentially indicates the fact that the way the temperature is rising is much more faster compared to what has been happening in the last 150 years. So that essentially indicates the fact that the global warming is happening. And because of this warming, the vulnerability, the degree of vulnerability is also kind of escalating day by day. And not only that, this climate change is bringing a lot of risks. And if you just want to identify some of the risks which has been identified by the global studies, there has been a study carried out by World Economic Forum, which identified that out of 10 most riskiest, aspects for the business, 5 of them are primarily, in fact, 6 of them are directly or indirectly connected to the climate change. You talk of extreme weather conditions, you talk of climate action failures, you talk of natural disaster, you talk of biodiversity loss, you talk of water, we talk of human-made environmental disaster. All these are indirectly or directly related to the climate change. So that essentially tells you the fact that the risks associated with climate change is going to be escalated day by day and is going to happen in a much more dangerous way that we are experiencing in the past. And these risks are often characterized into three different categories. You have physical risk, which are direct risk essentially, which are impacting the business in an operational manner, in their operational aspects, as well as the breaking of the supply chain is something which is going to impact the business as well. There are also transitional risks. Since you are transiting from the existing mode to the new mode, there has been a paradigm shift which is being experienced worldwide in different countries, including India. So it is expected that this transition would bring in a lot of transitional risk, be it in terms of technological change, be it in terms of market change, be it in terms of change in the regulation. All these is going to impact business in a very significant manner. Also, at the same time, you have this liability issues which would be emerging from climate change, because there will be a lot of legal cases. There have been, in fact, a lot of legal cases filed by different companies because of the stranded assets. We will quickly throw some light on that. So these are the risks which are coming to the business because of the climate change. I'll just skip this slide. And not only that, I just like to highlight that these risks are not only for the business, also for the countries. There have been a whole lot of debate happening now on how the climate change is going to impact the sovereign risks. Countries are increasingly becoming debt prone, or they're going to kind of borrow more funds from the global entities, and they're putting themselves in a debt prone situation as you go ahead in time. So you see that there's been a clear link between the climate change and sovereign risks and the costs of government borrowing, because those countries, those who are actually more vulnerable to climate change, they are going to face the crisis in the manner that the cost of government borrowing is going to be more and more for them. Just to give a highlight of the fact that there are countries which are known as vulnerable 20, and there have been studies which says that the cost of debt for them is much more higher compared to other countries, those who are not that much vulnerable. So that is something which is also very important when it comes to looking at the climate risks and threats. Just to highlight this, that even the South Asia, including our country, is highly vulnerable. And there has been studies, as I said, which essentially tells you the fact that those countries, those who are highly vulnerable, are also high debt, are going to face the high debt burdens. And that's something which has been not been discussed in the country context, not being discussed in the larger macroeconomic discourse, and which requires to be discussed. In fact, there has been some recognition in countries around the world, including India. If I just go back to show you what is happening in the Indian context, as I said, Indian Central Bank, RBI, also has asked now companies to disclose the climate-related risks, because that is going to be a significant risk coming from the climate change. The other issue which has been discussed and being discussed in different countries is about the stranded assets and business risks. Why stranded assets? Because climate-induced stranded assets is something which is going to play an important role, be it a company level or be it a country level. So at all levels, you see that stranded assets are going to be critical, going to hold the critical importance in a country's context. So basically, what is stranded assets? It essentially means that a particular asset which has been created is going to face the unanticipated or premature write-downs because of either maybe there is a change in the law of the land or maybe a transition happening and leading to regulatory changes. And this is something which is also very, very important in Indian context, because of the fact that the rate at which you are going to transit from the existing energy system to a new energy system, which is green or more sustainable, is going to create a kind of impact the size and the magnitude of the stranded assets. That's something which is very critical when it comes to energy transition. And there has been very less research so far has been done, particularly in this context, and particularly looking at how it's going to impact the country's economic development is something which has not been really prioritized as of now. There is also this climate action failure, and there is an interesting book which has come up on the green paradox. It essentially tells you that how the policy backfires, and sometimes you take actions, it's not going to help you, rather it backfires. Why is it so? It's primarily because of the fact that there is this fossil fuel companies, those who enjoy scarcity rent, and they want to basically maximize the profits by deciding when to extract their coal, oil, and gas reserves. But if you have a policy, which essentially kind of a tightening policy in terms of bringing taxes and in terms of kind of imposing norms, regulatory norms, not to extract the existing fossil fuel, so that would kind of incentivize the fossil fuel company to extract the resources now rather than keeping it for future. That essentially means that when you bring in a tax, let's say carbon tax, or let's say you have an energy tax, that might backfire in the sense that that might lead to further acceleration of the fossil fuel consumption and production. That is something which is green paradox, which also is something which is being relevant in the Indian context, given the fact that we have a timeline set in the net zero. So this is how the issues at the global level, when you talk about the risks, or you talk about stranded assets, or you talk about the issues around how the risks are actually being spreading either at the company level or the country level. So these are essential issues which actually require, which are making the whole transition debate much more complex and complicated. Now, because of all these issues, countries have also spelled out the net zero goals. And these net zero goals are very, very crucial because they are simply not net zero goals. Of course, there is a difference between gross zero and net zero, because countries cannot go for gross zero primarily because of the fact that there are certain technologies which are not available to countries and they cannot make it completely gross zero. The fact that I'm trying to highlight basically that if you look at the net zero targets, particularly here, if you look at that, so what happens is that most of the countries globally have set the target at 2050, whereas some countries have a timeline very different to the normal timeline which has been set globally. Let's, for example, you talk of China, it's 2060. Let's, for example, talk of India, it's 2070. It's not about the target. The target, as I said, as I already said, that's very, very important when it comes to, it's basically kind of creating a space, development space for you. Why? Because you need to develop, you need kind of carbon, and there is also a whole debate. This net zero issue is also related to something called carbon budget. Why is it so? Because you need, there is a debate happening globally, negotiation happening globally that how much carbon budget you get in order to progress. Because every extra GDP that you generate is going to impact the energy. Do you have a space to create that impact? And that is something which is debated globally, worldwide, in every COP meeting. So the 2070 target is not about a target. It's also a target for a country like us, who is actually trying to achieve the key developmental parameters like poverty, employment, inequality. At the same time, you also need to make all the development greener or sustainable. So that is something which is talk about when you talk about the 2070 target. Just to highlight that these targets, even though for a country like India, we have not made it law, where laws are usually mandatory, we have made it as part of policy. So some countries have already made it part of law. So if you look at countries, some of them have made it law. That means it's mandatory for those countries. Some countries like us have made it only at a policy level. Some of them are at a declaration stage. Some are yet to do this. So that means that globally, there is actually see there exists heterogeneity in terms of declaration of these laws, policies, and pledges. And most of the countries have now committed for net zero, and some countries have already become net zero. Like let's say Bhutan or Madagascar. These are the countries those have already net zero. Not now. It's not that we are doing it, estimating it, and because of that, have found them net zero. They have been perennially net zero because whatever they emit, their absorbing capacity is much more than the GHG emissions that are actually releasing to atmosphere. So that's the kind of thing that we see when we talk about net zero. Now, quickly coming to this, because of this transition, as I said, there is also a change in the geopolitics, and this change is very interesting. Also, becoming kind of bringing an additional layer of complexity to the whole debate on energy transition for any country, including India. And when we talk about this geopolitics, why this geopolitics? I just directly get into this because what we see earlier is that in the historically, what is happening is that we have been importing a lot of oil and gas from other countries, almost like close to 90% of the oil we are importing and a significant amount of gas as well. Now, this is going to change. Why? Because of the fact that we have started also in between, while simultaneously we are importing oil and gas, we also have started importing the solar panels from China. That means that your entire repositioning of the states is happening. And most important development, recent development is all about the critical minerals. And when you look at the critical minerals, it's actually bringing a very complex layer of challenge for a country like India, because on critical minerals, you talk of lithium, cobalt, all these, India is short in supply. And this is going to kind of enhance the dependency risk, and the supply dynamics is going to change, because both the mining and processing, I think there are, you talk of in terms of country level, I'll talk of a company level, kind of, if you see that India is in short supply, not only that, China is occupying significant amount of kind of power in terms of holding the mining, also in terms of processing. So China is going to be a global leader in terms of occupying all these resources and can dictate the pricing of these resources globally. So that shift is going to impact in a very different way to countries, those who are politically not well placed, also resource-wise not well placed. So also in terms of company, if you look at companies terms, so there are only few companies, those who are actually dominating in the critical mineral resources. So that would be expected that it will be like a oligopolistic market globally, and there would be like significant amount of market power, which will be used to drive the price up and can create problem in the future as well. So this is the kind of shift that you see. Just to give an example, and not only that, I just said that some countries kind of fearing that might create a significant energy problem for them. So they have started doing the resource nationalism. Of course, in India case, it's going to be very different. If you look at how the Mining Act got amended last year, and what is coming out very clearly is that in the Mining Act, we are allowing the auctioning, we are allowing the private sector to foray into the sector and get into the sector in terms of identifying areas and exploring the resources. So for us, we are more into the private sector. For other countries, it's more into government sector because it is actually already in the private hand. Government doesn't really want to allow those resources to be exported out to other countries. Hence, they have done the resource nationalism. For us, it is actually more of private sector. So there has been a change in the ownership structure and access rights to these resources in different countries in different way. That area is yet to be explored. That's something which is also going to impact India in a very significant manner, given the fact that we are getting into renewables in a large scale. I have given the limited time, I want to skip this slide because this is essentially talking about the fact that if you expand, given the fact that you're focusing on renewables, if you expand the renewables within South Asia, it can act as a win-win situation because there exists complementarity in load pattern. I don't really want to get into that. That actually kind of requires a technical discussion. But essentially, the idea is that if it is possible that Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka can create a collaborative win-win collaborative kind of a situation where both of them or all of them can actually win, given the fact that there exists load complementarity across countries. That means the peak loads for different countries are very different when you look at the timing of the energy requirements and all. Now I'll come back to the specific case of India, where I'll be throwing in 10 minutes time, I'll throw some light on two complex issues that India is going to face as far as the energy transition debate in India is concerned. Quickly, I'll just skip this slide because this essentially talks about the fact that how India is entering in a big way in the larger umbrella of the energy transition, be it in terms of the target that is set for the renewables, be it in terms of the energy mix, changing energy mix, be it in terms of the new energy, new areas. You talk of, let's become sectoral integration. You talk of, let's say, green hydrogen, battery storage system, or you talk of electric vehicles. All these are going to play important role in the energy transition discourse in Indian context. And not only that, as I said, that there has been also change in the modalities of power procurement. We have been relying on regulation. We are moving from regulation to market. It's obvious, but the way this is going to change is going to be impactful in very different ways. And as I said, there's also been a lot of focus on decentralized energy systems recently, given the fact that the grid-based energy systems have their own pros and cons. A new set of reform and policy initiatives have been already taken. Sectoral integration, transport sector and electricity sector is actually getting integrated in a very meaningful, very interesting way through the electric vehicles. That also requires a separate discussion altogether. Just to, as I said, that if you look at this particular slide, it's a very simple graphic, but as a powerful implication in the sense that if you look at the ownership structure, almost like more than 90% of the assets, renewable energy assets in this country are owned by the public sector. Whereas if you look at fossil fuel industry, even today, 50% of assets are still owned by the public sector. So that there is a difference here. That essentially means that if you're expecting that private sector is going to play an important role in this sector, then you have to create that incentive structure. Not only that, you also have to be very careful because the way the pricing would evolve in future is going to be a public policy issue in the country context. There has been also a change in the pricing of the renewables, given the fact that, as I said, we have moved away from the regulatory regimes to a market regime. So we started with a lot of development. I'll directly go to that particular slide just to give an idea that how the public policy instruments have been used in this country for the growth of renewables. If you look at historically, all these instruments, you talk of your M&S tariff, or you talk of preferential tariff structure, you talk of feed-in tariff, accelerated depreciation schemes, all these are publicly supported. So then we moved away from the publicly supported instrument regime to a regime which is more like publicly and private market-led growth. Let's, for example, we talk of renewable energy certificates. So that's actually a clear example of how publicly supported and market-led growth are combined when you try to understand the renewable energy growth in this country. And finally, we are moving to a regime which is more or completely market-driven. You talk of auctions. You have e-reverse auctions in the wind case, solar case, and other cases also. That essentially tells you the fact that if you look at how the instruments have grown over time, so it has been, there is a trajectory. We started with a publicly supported instrument regime towards a mix of publicly supported and market-driven. And then finally, we are in a regime where the market-driven approaches are more preferred. Of course, publicly supported schemes still exist. So there is a simultaneous presence of all these together, but dominant presence is basically the market-led growth. Now, quickly, just next 5 minutes to give you an idea of how the coal transition debate is unfolding in this country, why it becomes very important for a country to debate on coal. Because if you go back to the COP26, we discussed about the coal phase down and coal phase out. India didn't agree to this coal phase out idea because India cannot quickly do it, even though we know coal is not good for environment. But why we should need more time? Why there is a target for 2070, as I said? There is incremental change which is adapted, or a change which is in between the incremental and radical. Why is it so? Because if you look at the coal sector itself, I mean, coal is an important sector for the economy. If you look at, it's very much integrated in the economic development of this country. In terms of employment, 12 million people are employed, and most of them are in the informal sector. That means you do not exactly know what is the nature, character of this employment. Coal also contributes to the railways in terms of the freight charges, which actually subsidizes the passenger fare. Coal also, if you look at the eastern side of this country, coal significantly contributes to the state revenue. Not only that, if you look in terms of district mineral foundations and all that, so coal has a significant role in this country. Not only that, if you stop coal and then you create renewable energy assets on the other side of the country, so it's actually lead to kind of macroeconomic impact. Why? Because it might aggravate the inequality. Because those who are employed in coal, they are immobile largely they are immobile. You cannot really take them from the coal sector and employ them in the renewable energy sector because they are mostly informal and unorganized sector workers. They cannot be trained easily. So you can see the problem here. So you cannot really shut down the coal plants quickly. So there is a discussion which is happening that whether you can actually identify, go for a modification in terms of using the same, let's say, thermal power plants, but you go for a more greener regime gradually. So this gradualism, incremental approach is being favored than quickly shutting down or phasing out the coal is something which is very, very challenging for a country like India. Then I'll come to the discussion on the decentralized renewable energy options, because there has been a target in this country which primarily focuses on the grid-based supply systems. But if we look at the target, we also had a target that we should have 30 gigawatts of the decentralized renewable energy systems, but that is not very successful. We only could achieve 1/4 of the target which was set by 2022. Now the question is, why is it so? Of course, anything which is decentralized nature is not very easy to manage and operate. So there are other reasons as well. It's why it's primarily because of the fact that if you look at the industry itself, if you look at the solar industry particularly, and you see that the way the mergers and acquisitions happen in this country for last 10, 15 years, particularly in solar big scale. So it is usually said that India's solar industry is big boys game, because there has been a lot of mergers, acquisitions happen. And as a result of which you see that there's been also a dramatic fall in the price. But the question is that whether the price discovery, particularly for the utility scale, grid-based large scale solar, is true, or is it something which is just coming out as a visible number, or is it something which is hidden inside the number? That is something also is to be discussed. One of my colleagues here, Terry Sass, has done an interesting study and found very clearly that if you look at the decentralized energy systems, they are not equally bad. They are equally good when we try to compare that with grid-based system, because grid-based systems also have a landed cost. That means the power is generated somewhere. When it comes to reaches at a home, so the price is very different compared to what you do in case of decentralized energy systems. Not only that, there are also other benefits associated with the decentralized energy systems. Let's, for example, land. India is known to be land-deprived country. And for a large-scale grid-based solar utility, solar project, you need at least for 1 megawatt a project, you need 2 acres of land. So that essentially tells you the story that for decentralized energy systems, you don't really need, because it's too much dispersed. You can have it either ground mounted or on the top of a roof. So that essentially means that land, from the land point of view, DRE system is much more preferred compared to the other system. Now, water also, you need huge amount of water in one place. If you look at, let's say, large scale projects, either in Karnataka, Gujarat, these are the areas where water is either scarce or
Are
not.
you hearing me, Gopal?
Yes, yes, please.
Hold for a moment. Let's see what went wrong.
Yes, please.
Just hold on a second. Our tech is looking.
Shall I move?
Can you say something? Let's see.
Shall I move now?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
You can raise your hand if you're hearing. Right, but we are not hearing you at the moment. So just wait a second. Something went wrong here.
Okay.
Can you say hello again?
Hello.
All right, please go ahead.
Yeah, so as I said that when you talk about decentralized renewable energy systems, they are far better in terms of using the resources, be it land resource or water resource, or in terms of employment also. There have been studies which indicates that in terms of employment, a small scale rooftop solar can create 24.7 jobs per every megawatt installed compared to big scale, large scale, utility scale solar, which essentially creates 3 to 4 jobs. So that essentially means that when you try to understand the decentralized renewable energy systems, either in terms of the resources, land, water, or employment, they're much more favorable compared to the centralized thing. And probably there has been a policy understanding which has actually happened in the country, and that is why there has been a recent focus on the decentralized. You talk of Surya Ghar scheme, which is discussed 2 months before, which is declared 2 months before, or you talk of Kusum scheme, which is basically a scheme which talks about energizing the the energizing the agriculture, irrigation system. All these are leading towards emphasis on the decentralized energy systems in this country. So finally, I'll come to the final uh, slide of my talk. Basically, I just said that I'm not going to conclude, but basically give you indicative ideas to all of you to think about it. And one of the questions which have been revolving around the energy transition in this country is about the rate of change, whether you go for a radical change or you go for incremental change. And you have middle way. Can you modify the existing assets? Because if you don't do that, I just said one of the major issues is essentially you are ending off having a lot of stranded assets. What are you going to do with those assets? And as you know that some of these are actually not, they cannot be recyclable. So there is also this circular economy issue as well. Now, the second is also, as I said, that market segmentation. You talk about, as I said, there has been transition temporarily in terms of the instrument growth. And if you look at, let's for example, I have not discussed about electric vehicle, let's say. You have 30 states and 30 electric vehicle policies. And as I said, why market segmentation? Primarily because of the fact that most of the energy transition sectors or all these related sectors would be driven by the private sector. And there is a competition happening across states in terms of attracting the private investment. And that is leading to market segmentation across states. And that is something which is also becoming problematic in future. Competition in some ways good, also at the same time can also create problems, particularly if you try to understand it from welfare-oriented government. And then balancing the sectoral integration, one of the issues I said is essentially how the electricity sector is getting integrated with the transport sector. Let's, for example, you go for electric vehicle, and if you don't really change the grid composition, that essentially means that you're relocating the pollution. Let's, for example, you have good air in Delhi, you can reduce the pollution, local pollution, but at what cost? You can create thermal power plants, let's say in Jharkhand. So that essentially means that you're relocating the pollution, if you don't really balance this sectoral integration in a way which is desired. And then there are also, as I said, the way the things are happening at the central level, federal level in this country is much more faster than states can adapt to that. So that essentially means there is a capacity constraint at the state level, and that needs to be populated, that needs to be filled. So the end of this particular point is basically that you need to create an ecosystem in a manner which is very, very important when I talk about something like a energy transition. And all these, as I said, are conundrums because none of them have actually received a final answer to this. This is more like a process. It will evolve over time. But as I said, it is happening at all scales, at different rates, and different sizes. So that's the end of my talk. And I'll be happy to discuss if anything is coming to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sarangi, thank you so much. We are not hearing you as loudly as I would like, and I don't know what's the solution. He's on his system is working. Well, what's going on here? Should I ask him to reconnect? Can you reconnect? Can you just disconnect and then reconnect? Let's try.
I'll reconnect. Okay.
Yes, please do that.
Okay.
Let's check your mic. Oh,
Yes, I have reconnected now. Okay. Am I audible? Is it better now?
We are seeing you nice and clear, but we're not hearing you nice and clear. Well, let's start with the question. So by the time.
Yes, please.
You're hearing. Okay. All right. Yes. People are hearing. So if you can't hear at the back, you can come forward. So we have a few. Let's see who might have. I have a few points, but let me see from the audience first. Any comments or questions? Anyone? Somebody would like to raise anything? Let me start then, if I don't see any hands. So 1 or 2 points, Professor Sarangi. The first point is, I found quite well. First of all, I should thank you. I found the talk very comprehensive and interesting. The um, the first conundrum that caught my mind was the one on green paradox. The green paradox, I think, creates a real conundrum because with stranded assets, if you try to move to green, people are going to say, all right, before my asset gets stranded, I better use it up now. So that would lead to greater hydrocarbon use. So that's a real conundrum, and it will be interesting to see how that's being managed. You know, how that paradox is being resolved. If you have read the book, maybe you have an insight to share with us on how they are managing that, because I can see people rushing to utilize their hydrocarbons. The next point I'd make is you have used these two words quite often, complex and complicated. But I think you appreciate that these are very different things in when you study complexity, and the approach to complicated is very different from the approach to complex, which will involve, human interactions and so on. So the strategies for dealing with complicated and complex in any transition quite different. So that's just an observation. The other paradox that I want to mention is this issue. The 20 countries that are so vulnerable to climate change also have high debt. That one I wasn't aware of. And that combination clearly can be really tragic, disastrous for those countries because they're not going to be credit worthy, the interest rates are going to be high. And I don't know that the macroeconomics people are dealing with it really well yet. So that's a good point for our macroeconomists who are in the room. And the last point from my side is the ownership of the renewables and the ownership of the hydrocarbons. 90% of the renewables, as you say, owned by the public sector, 50% of fossil fuels owned by the public sector as well. So to get the private sector engaged in innovation would really require a different set of incentives, as you were pointing out, than might be in place now. So what might those incentives be? Those are some of the points I observed. Anything else from anyone before I let Dr. Sarangi? Or just go ahead and respond to those, and then we'll wrap it up. We have
Yeah.
a few minutes, maybe
Yeah,
5 minutes, quick.
shall
Go
I
ahead.
go ahead?
Yeah,
Shall I go ahead in responding?
please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just start with the last question. I think the ownership, probably I have, I don't know, what I said essentially is that 90% of the renewable energy assets are owned by the private investors, not the public. Whereas in case of hydrocarbon, it's the reverse. I mean, if you look at, so it's basically the public sector owning the significant size of the asset compared to the private sector. And that is where the role of incentives actually coming in. And if you look at historically, in fact, there is a study which has been done by me, looking at how the incentive structures have evolved. And interestingly, what is happening is that we are moving away from a publicly designed incentive structure. Let's say you talk about feed-in tariff, is a globally accepted incentive structure worldwide, invented by Germany, and well accepted, well implemented in the Indian context as well. The point is basically that this is also going to change, and are moving to a regime which would be primarily market-driven. Let's say reverse actions. So that's the point. That essentially means that the question which is being debated is that if renewable energy is actually creating, let's say, positive spillover effects, would you call it as a merit good, or will it become pure private good? And if it is a merit good, then what extent government can subsidize, or can it be directly provided by government? That issue is something which is problematic and which is not really, as I said, received the kind of research attention, public policy attention that it deserves. Then come back to I think the debt related issues. Yes, true. Why is it so? Because if you look at, I'll just give an example. There is a group called, there is this group which is not a formal group, is called Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP. So JETP is essentially a group of countries from the developed countries. And what do they want to do? Basically, they want to give you loans And why? The purpose is to meet the just energy transition issues. Now, the question is that when you get these loans, you have to pay back with interest. And you know that if you're paying back the interest, then you are actually, and given that most of the countries are having budgetary, limited budgetary dispensation. So in that context, you see clearly that they might fall short of the resources in dealing with the climate vulnerability. So that is leading to accentuating or aggravating the climate vulnerability for these countries. Those are already poor and they are facing the vulnerability from the extreme weather conditions, be it flood or be it drought condition or be it extra, let's say cyclone and all that. So that's the issue which is around high debt. Green paradox is something which is a very new concept. And what is happening is that this is, as I said, getting much more compounded. If I use that term, okay, I'm using, let's say, complex and then complicated, I'm using the compounded. Why is it so? It's primarily because of the fact that you have this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has come up by the European Union. Now that is indirectly forcing companies, let's say in developing countries, including India, to go for carbon neutral products, or at least products having less carbon intensity. Now that is in what way that would be going to kind of getting operationalized in countries like India is yet to be seen. So, and then as you rightly said, you have rightly pointed out the fact that the designing of the tax, because India is also entering into the carbon market in a big way. And there is also a lot of discussion happening under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, which is basically a joint crediting mechanism, bilateral cooperation between different countries. And how is it going to be realized by the private companies, and how are they going to, whether they want to kind of motivated to extract more fossil resources, something is yet to be seen. So I think green paradox is very new idea, and how it is getting implemented, operationalized, yet to be seen. We'll see how this is going to happen in future. Thank you. Thank you for your insights.
Wonderful, wonderful. Look, thank you very much.
I had one question, Professor Naris.
Oh, we have two questions.
Yes, please.
I think, Anika, you want some?
I just want us to check online whether there are questions.
Oh, okay.
So I've asked earlier, but somehow they meant to tell me that they didn't understand what I wanted. Could
Okay,
we just
okay.
check if there are questions online? Gopal, this is Anika. I don't know if you remember me.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a book that has just come out on India's energy transition. Would you like to review that?
Anika wants you to review her book.
We'll be happy to do that, Anika. Last time I
Excellent.
couldn't meet my timeline, but I'm available now because my classes are over. So I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Well, we have, it's an international publication to begin with. It will take some time until it's available.
Sure.
So maybe mid-August, but I'll be happy to send a copy across.
I'll be happy to do that. I'm so sorry. Last time I couldn't meet my timeline. I'm going through
No, but
my.
a lot of the questions are in the book. So,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
at least raised or touched
Sure,
upon.
sure, sure.
So, yeah.
All
Yeah,
right,
Professor-
go ahead,
Yeah,
Baran.
Professor Sharangan, thanks for the talk. I have just one question regarding the public debt. Now, most of the developing nations or economies, they are suffering already from higher burden of debt, right?
Right.
And at the same point of time, if you're pushing them towards, let's say, transition of energy, do you think like they have any other alternative other than going for the debt? And the question is, if they're going in for public debt, whether it is domestic or international one, then a large chunk of their tax revenue will go towards the interest income, right? Interest payment. So what can be the other alternative policies you can think about in order to make a smooth transition? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very good question, but I don't have actually direct answer to the last part of the question that you said. But I must highlight the fact that the debt is for what? Is it for meeting the climate vulnerability? If it is so, then you are not creating the asset. If you're, let's for example, creating assets, probably there is a possibility of kind of reinvest that money and get the return to pay back your loan. But the question is, if you are meeting the, let's say there is a high flood or extreme weather conditions like, let's say, cyclonic storm, so then you are actually not creating assets. You are essentially kind of adapting to the situation, and that loan money is spent on kind of saving people. In that case, you can actually get trapped, or you will be part of this debt trapped. So that's the issue which is coming up in a significant manner for countries, particularly for the low-lying countries, those who are very close to the to the sea. So these 20 vulnerable countries are essentially the countries those who are actually highly vulnerable in terms of
Like
the
small islands and so
yeah,
on.
small island countries and all that. So I think for
Low-lying
them it is really this more like a vicious circle. So you cannot really get back to paying back your loan by investing money in creating the renewable energy assets. But let's, for example, getting the money for let's say getting your critical minerals. Probably in that case, you're reinvesting that money. So in that case is very different. So how are they? What path or what trajectory they are going to adopt is something which is very difficult to answer, because that is something which is happening at a country level, and that is what they're demanding for a for larger timeline, so extended timeline. That is why we have 2070. How the carbon budget is going to be distributed. That is every COP. I was there in COP 2018 Dubai. So nothing happened. I mean, there's keep on discussing, negotiating what is going to happen, how much carbon budget you are going to get. So these are issues which are actually creating the impacts, and which is eventually is impacting the macroeconomic functioning of any country. And it has been well recognized by RBI. If you look at the RBI disclosure requirements, they're saying that all companies will have to disclose the risks coming from the climate change by 2026, and they'll create the metrics and measurement units by 2018. So that clearly tells you that you are risk prone, and you have to be careful in terms of looking at the impacts of climate change. That only I can say. I'm sorry that I couldn't answer the last part of the question. What would be the right trajectory to follow is not very clear as of now. Thank you so much.
But if I might add to that
Yes, please.
answer, Subharan, I would suggest that would be looking at increasing funding for adaptation, because climate adaptation is getting nowhere near what mitigation is getting. So that's one thing that the international community should be looking at. When we had the high debt overhang, remember the HIPIC days, then we should be looking at that again, and then looking at a vulnerability fund. You know, the green climate fund is supposed to be 100 billion. So some of that should be going to these countries on a concessionary basis. So all of these we need to be looking at as potential solutions. But Dr. Sarangi, thank you so much again for taking the time. Great talk. Sorry, we had a little bit of technical challenges here and there.
No problem,
but finally,
sir.
it worked out.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be there and discussing. I would have loved to be there in person. Unfortunately, due to some prior commitment,
That's all right. That's all right.
Next time I'll come in. Thank you, sir.
Thanks again. That concludes our session.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.